Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. This is our ninth episode. We're nearing that double-digit mark.
Yeah.
And I am your host, Derek. With me, the other host here, Evan. Hello and
Hey,
good day to you, sir.
good day to you, sir.
All right, today we are going to talk about the issues of inspiration and translation when it comes to the
Mhm.
Bible. So, uh, I, before I start, actually, let's start this
Yeah.
way. Do you have any major thoughts on this subject? Is it something you've given a lot of thought to, or anything like jump out at you with this issue?
Not much aside from that. I've always wanted to learn Greek and Hebrew, but
There you
that's
go.
that's more than the like I guess inner nerd in me wanting
Right,
to learn another language.
right.
Um, Beyond that, though, not much except for a few moments being bothered by certain translations from the message,
Mm,
feeling like it's when you see kind of the extreme of an issue, you begin to see, okay, there is a point at which this becomes a problem.
okay, yeah, yep.
Because you begin to see that somebody who's translating the message is putting a lot of what their interpretation, and I'm not speaking language
Hmm.
interpretation, but I'm speaking ideological interpretation into how they're presenting the text. And
Nice.
so I would say that that at least gives me a sense that there's something wrong, or there can be something wrong here when you see a translation going on, and that we could run into issues.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so we're coming from a similar, I think, place here. So first, I just want to say I do believe that the Bible is the divinely inspired Word of God. Right. That is, I believe that to be true. This is true. I think of all Christians believe that. The question, though, is what does that mean? you know.
That's reasonable.
Um, and so there are several different schools of thought on how inspired the Bible is. I don't think we're going to go through each of them right now. If there
Mm-mm.
is some interest, let us know in the feedback in the comments, email, all that kind of stuff. Maybe we'll do an episode dedicated to exploring each of those different
Yeah.
ideas. Right now, I just want to focus on what the approach we'll take here, right?
Yeah.
Um, and counter that with one very specific example. So I see it very much as a cosmic message, if you will, that is communicated to the biblical authors who then translated it into a language that they were familiar with, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so uh, I don't see it as being inspired down to word choice necessarily. However, I do think the word choice matters. So, in other words, I don't see it as like this, like auto writing thing where people sort of went into some sort of trance inspired by the Holy Spirit, or writing down the exact words that the Holy Spirit told them to, and that kind of thing. That's not really how I see it. Um, I more see it as though that the message is divinely inspired, and that really is the key of what we want to understand from the Bible. And I want to specifically hit that some issues with that word level inspiration, because I think that's at least in more traditional Christian circles, that's probably the main way people think of it. And I find it interesting. It creates this conundrum where you could only really understand what the Bible's saying then if you understood the native language. Like
Mm-hmm.
you would have to say the same thing Muslims say about the Quran,
Yeah.
right? That you
Yeah.
could really only understand the Quran if you read it in its native language. So you can't really comment on it otherwise. Um, and I honestly think that if churches truly believed that this was the case, then the very first thing you should be doing as a church is hosting or sponsoring Hebrew and Greek classes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that should come before everything else that you
Hmm.
do as a church. That should be number
Hmm.
one. And you
Hmm.
should constantly, as elders or pastors, whatever, be encouraging people to get involved in those classes, because that's the only way they can really understand the Bible anyways.
Yeah.
And so I don't, I guess I would say actions betray beliefs.
Yeah.
So I don't think churches that even say they think that, I don't think they really do, because then they
Yeah.
would be sponsoring these classes, you know?
Yeah.
And the mere fact that they're not, to me, suggests you don't really believe that,
Yeah.
you know?
There's a difficulty that arises when you're well, and this is where it's a lot of degrees. There's a difficulty that arises when you try to strictly hold to words, because words are ambiguous. That at least every word tends to have a small bit of ambiguity, which is what
We're
makes.
actually going to get into that.
Well, there we go.
So yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that makes translation so difficult, and so if you're expecting, if people have to not only understand the ambiguity in their own language, but also understand the ambiguity in an ancient language. Mm-hmm. There's a practical part of me that says, well, why would God establish that many barriers to understanding?
Yeah.
This message, in
mm-hmm.
encoding it in that particular way. We spent a lot of time in the other episodes talking about how humans tend to interpret things in stories, and therefore a lot of the Bible is conveyed in the story, and therefore a story lens is a good way to do it. All of that points to the idea that there is an attempt within the Bible to make things more easily understood, not to make things more difficult to understand. That doesn't mean they don't have depth. That's a big difference. But it does mean that initial understanding of them there's not that many barriers to getting it. The stories are relatively simple, even though they're deep.
Agreed.
So this emphasis on text is crazy.
I think there's an issue too, that if you look at it as being inspired down to the word choice, and words don't line up perfectly between languages, and then grammar especially doesn't. Any translation is ultimately doomed to produce at the very least, diminished version of the original message. But more possible, I think, even, is a potentially dangerous, unintentionally produced, perverted version of the message.
Yeah.
Right. If the message is like detailed down to the word choice in that way. However, I think if you look at it, the message that's being divinely inspired, if one is accurately able to assess the message, then they can properly translate that message. So that's my thought on the general inspiration part of this. And now I'm going to say something that appears to counter everything that I just said, because that said, I think actually the details do matter to the message. And I want to first say, the way I look at this is I think about a picture, right? If you have a picture and you look at it at a low resolution, you can make out images depending on how low you go. You could go very low with the resolution. You can see big parts of the image and small parts of the image in different colors and that kind of thing. And then you can slowly increase the resolution so that a picture comes more and more and more into focus. Okay. That is the way I view like the process of Bible study and understanding the message of the Bible, right? The picture is there, it's complete. It's just we can start with a low resolution version of it, and as we move forward, get more and more and more detail and more and more. It's not that the image changes, it's that it becomes clearer to us.
Yeah.
So to that end, I think a lot of Christians have sort of a low resolution view of Christianity. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem, right? I think, the message of salvation is the most important thing, right? It's that biggest thing in the image, right?
Yeah.
That
That's
we're
the
seeing
two
at a low,
pixels of color that you
right?
see.
Yeah, yeah. It's the in that low resolution. It's fine. That is the thing you have to know. That's the most important thing you see in that image.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think as we look closer at the image, as we get more and more into the detail, that image will become refined. And what we find is that parts of the image end up being more important than we previously thought they were, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're a bigger deal. Now, for instance, you could have a picture where it has a giant barn in the picture, right? And so at a low resolution, you're going to look at this big red blotch and say, well, that must be the most important thing in the image. And then as you
Mm-hmm.
zoom closer, perhaps the detail of animals or something happening nearby the barn, maybe there's a
Mm-hmm.
wedding close to the barn or something, that you're going to realize, oh, that's actually the most important thing in that picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think with the message of the Bible, it's that drastic a shift, right? I think the barn is still the focus of the picture in the Bible analogy. However, I do think there are elements of the full picture that with our low resolution, we think it's a big deal. And then when we get closer, we realize, oh no, this other thing actually matters a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, so that is where I say that I think the message is divinely inspired. It's then communicated into a language that, the author is familiar with. But the details still matter. I'm going to give one small example of this, okay? In the Garden of Eden story, after the sin, we're told that God joins Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm.
And this is translated a few different ways, but it's said as the cool of the day. It's
Mm-hmm.
we're told that it's the windy part of the day. Uh, However, that word, if you go and you look closely at that word, you can see, and there's a Bible Hub is a great place to do this. You click on the word, you can see all the other times that word is used.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, that word is actually translated meaning breath, God's breath, man's breath, this breathing thing. So it's not that I think it's necessarily a mistranslation to translate it as the windy part of the day or the cool part of the day. But if you were someone who was, an ancient speaker of Hebrew, and you heard someone read that phrase or repeat that phrase, or you read that phrase yourself, you're going to have with that particular word other connotations, other meanings attached to it. This whole
Mm-hmm.
breath thing would pop up in your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we think of that passage in context of, okay, windy part of the day, but also there's this weird breathy component that this word means to, the meaning of what's happening there becomes a lot clearer, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that particular story doesn't tell us the time of day or the
Mm-hmm.
weather at any other portion, right?
Yeah.
So there's a reason the author decided to include this little thing right in this spot. And I think it is to bring up that breath concept in relation to the fact that just a few verses earlier, we're told that Adam is made into man via the process of combining earth, dust with this God breathed
Mm-hmm.
portion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so suddenly we could see, oh wow, this period of time that Adam was clearly experiencing regularly with God
Mm-hmm.
was this portion of the day that he would get together with God. It had this breath component to it, right? We could see that
Mm-hmm.
as it being rejuvenating to Adam, it being life-giving to Adam, it being something that was propelled him up to a higher spiritual sense, right? Since you have the earthly half and the real spiritual half. And that's what he was experiencing with God, was this closeness, this like spiritual sharing breath closeness. That is not something that is conveyed in the English translation, the windy part of the day,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and so that is the kind of detail that do you have to know that to understand the fall of man and the story of Adam and Eve?
Mm-hmm.
No, you don't. But understanding that detail emphasizes for you further just what exactly is lost because of the fall, right?
Yeah.
And that's a detail that an ancient man hearing it might have recognized, that we don't really have a good way to translate that into an English telling. But as we zoom in, we can see a greater resolution. So that is sort of the way I think of the details at the word choice level, is that the message conveys the main parts of the message, if you will. It's just, it becomes more precise as you zoom in and look at the details of word choice.
Yeah, yeah. It would be comparable to, relatively comparable to seeing a version of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde in translation, because in that play, earnest is a name, but also EARNEST, earnest,
Right.
as in being sincere,
Right.
and that is played upon so much throughout that play. And I'm actually now curious, how do people actually translate that? Because
Right, because if
that
it's not a
doesn't
name,
translate
yeah,
if it's not, or if it's not that meaning
it has to be
in the
both
other,
the name
the
shared
name
with
and
a
the
word
meaning.
that has that
Exactly.
meaning. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, translators run into that all the time. And having read a few books, share of books in translation, every translator deals with this differently. Some will, even if there is a pun in the other language, will leave footnotes saying there's a pun going on here that we can't translate, but here's what the pun is, which kind of ruins it a little bit. But we will run into that same issue throughout the Bible.
Yeah, I've read, for instance, a translation of Dante's Divine
Inferno.
Comedy. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've and the translator did a good job of using footnotes to put that kind of stuff in there, right? And this is sort of, I think, the necessity of deeper Bible study, right? Is our Bible, it has a few footnotes here and there, but truthfully, you could, if you wanted all of the appropriate footnotes to be in the Bible, it would be, 8 times as long.
Exactly.
It would be massive. So
Yeah.
each book of the Bible would be as big as the Bible is right now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
but yeah, so that's why we would delve into that. So I want to shift real quick here now to saying,
Of
so
course.
what translation are we using, right, for this process? And I personally assume that there is no translation that properly encapsulates all the layers of meaning in the original Bible.
Yeah.
And so that's why the study is necessary, right? Because what is the Bible supposed to, what are you supposed to translate to capture that breath thing, right? Adam got together with God at the breathy time of day. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like there's not a great way to translate what is happening there.
Yeah.
So there's no Bible that sort of perfectly gets all of the layers, and that's why you have to study. So it's language evolves over time, and so we've lost some of the elements necessary to get a good translation. And perhaps maybe as we go forward, right, language will get better and better and match up better. I don't know. But a big issue I see in terms of translation is that our modern language has become very material truth first in our mindset. That's the way we approach things, and so our language reflects that, and that is very ill-equipped to capture the full depth of the spiritual to functional mindset that I think is at the center of the Bible, and I think at the center of the languages in the Bible. I think ancient man thought generally more in terms of this like spiritual functional realm, but just out of necessity they were very ill-equipped to really put together material truths, and so they couldn't have this material truth focused mindset. So English is, I think, particularly, and modern language in general is particularly ill-equipped to translate this. So for me personally, if I'm just sitting down and just reading the Bible through, I will usually do the ESV, just because I know that's one of only a couple translations that pulls from the most recent Dead Sea Scroll
Yeah.
knowledge that we've acquired from that. But for the case of real study, I will look very closely at several different translations as well as the Hebrew words themselves. And what I do primarily with the Hebrew words is look at the other ways those words have
Words
been
are used. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's that idea of the earnest thing you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
I think that's important. I'm beginning to do some actual learning of Hebrew myself, but I don't view that as massively important. I think some people may, but to me, the social and cultural context in which a language used has such an influence on the meaning of that language, and we're not ancient Hebrew speakers and we don't
Yeah.
live in that world. And
Yeah.
so some of the value, I think, of translation is lost because we're going to end up looking at the Hebrew language in like our modern social and cultural context, and we'll attempt maybe to look back at how ancient man might have thought of it. But again, we're not ancient man, so the best we're doing is sort of just projecting our idea of ancient man on that, which is valuable, but it's not flawless, right? Which is why, again, I go to, it's the message that matters, not the particular word choice, because our best attempts at understanding the particular word in ancient Hebrew and its meaning is still not going to be perfect, right? So in terms of that, reading the book in its original form is the only way you can understand it. That's lost to us for good, in a sense. So I think, go ahead.
So I want to go back to that point about the and just ask more questions about the difference between modern languages being more connected materially and ancient potentially being more functional and spiritual. I see the contention for the functional I think very readily, because they were more connected to survival, and were more likely to run the risk of being wiped out if they didn't have a functional perspective on the world. What makes you think it has potentially more spiritual emphasis?
So there is a book. It is called The Lost World of Genesis 1 by a guy named John, some initial Walton. And it was a good book. We'll probably talk a little more about it. But he specifically looks at, okay, let's look at what ancient cultures and societies around the time of the Bible were doing. And there is a pattern to Genesis 1 that fits the patterns of lots of stories in ancient cultures. And they're temple establishment narratives. So there are these narratives where they're about a deity setting up a temple from which they will reign. And his argument is that is what Genesis 1 captures. Now, I would argue with him, and then he goes on to say, well, it doesn't mean all of these other interpretations. My thought is, I want to take a very yes and approach and say, hey, I think it could absolutely be a temple establishing narrative, as well as Hugh Ross's idea that it's like, no, this actually describes the story of creation too, just poetically. Why if our God is who we claim he is, why couldn't it be both, right? Why couldn't both those messages be captured in there? But that is what I mean. So the language itself being more built around the spiritual is those words, especially within that context, would in all likelihood to an ancient reader read very much as a God establishing his temple. And the Garden of Eden being this place where he would meet with man, this temple adjacent place. And so that's what I mean, I guess, about the language being a little bit more spiritually focused there.
Okay, this inclines me to think about I'm in the midst of Guns Germ Steel right now by Jared Diamond.
Oh, yeah.
Well, at this point, it's actually a little bit of an old book, but he talks a little bit about different formations of society, going from bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. And he talks about the formation of chiefdoms and states, chiefdoms being larger than the previous two, and then states being obviously the largest in terms of population densities and the number of people ruled. And he talks about frequently how religion is a tool used to kind of validate a state. And so if we're talking about this particular time period, especially being major steps in terms of state formations, so things being viewed through a religious lens makes sense to me in terms of that too. So you talk about how this oftentimes seems to be language of a god establishing a temple to rule from. Well, I think that was very functional too, is that oftentimes the rulers of the early day were considered deities in the case of like ancient Egypt, or Sumeria, were considered certain conduits with deities. Sometimes they would separate those functions and you would have a king and a priest class, but they would still interact very closely. But I think that's very interesting. And the more we talk about it, the more I think, yeah, that probably is true, because most things were being looked at through the religious lens because it seemed to legitimize what was happening.
Right.
And would legitimize a state by saying that there was a god behind this
and
facade.
that is specifically that spiritual to functional connection, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And in a sense, when you're in a state of lacking the way ancient man was, more less rich, I guess, than we are.
Yeah.
You would be more interested in that spiritual to functional connection, because it's like, I don't need the details of the nutrients that are inside the cow I'm about to eat. I just need to eat the cow. How do I eat the cow? How do I go through this functional process, right?
Yeah.
And then there is the question of what is the right way to eat a cow. And I know that sounds weird, but that is sort of a spiritual thing, right? The question of the right and wrong way to do things. And if you look at many of the law, right, of the law in the Old Testament, there are a lot of things that are the law that we now know are actually wonderful sanitary things, in terms of living life in this state of lacking and state of needing stuff, and it's beneficial in that way. It's so the right way to do it corresponds with a healthier outcome. We see that there. So that is the question of the right way to do something is and always has been a spiritual question. This is why ancients, Israelites and elsewhere, tied the idea of a long life, right, to righteous behavior. Because it just sort of stood to reason, well, if you're doing the right thing,
you're going
world, you're working in concert with how the world is meant to work, and you'll have a more successful life or lengthy life as that is, right? And then Jesus takes that idea and sort of says, you're right, but then there's also this flipped on the head part of it where, but if the world is broken as it is because of sin, there's also this possibility that the more righteous you behave, the more quickly you are destroyed by the broken parts of the world. So, but now we're getting way down the road. So
let me come back one sec, just because I think this idea is fascinating of more fundamentally religious languages, of languages somehow being more spiritually minded,
more suited.
Because I want to look at now then. If we're going to contend that now is no longer religiously minded, maybe extend this idea and then you can play with it a little bit. But what justifies states right now? Extending that idea logically. Sure. I don't think we view states as somehow divinely justified, and that depends on the person, but
Yeah,
that is a larger portion of the population. Even the religious portion of the population doesn't view the state as necessarily being
yeah, I know.
religiously justified. Exactly.
Right.
And so, and we won't have that debate right now. But because I don't think we necessarily need to. We can do that in another episode. But I think that's actually that does change the way we look at the world. We don't necessarily look at then the spiritual things being as heavily involved in what we're doing presently. And we could talk about the effects of that, but I think you're right in saying that it does affect our language, that we don't look at the world. Our language kind of adjusts our perspective on the world, the lens we look through it.
Yeah, and if that's a difficult concept for people to understand, let me give something a little maybe
tangible,
easier to grasp onto, right?
Yeah.
If we were to theorize, which I think it is utterly possible that this may happen at some point, the idea of a microchip, right, that you could insert in your head that would give you access to all the different languages at once.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's likely that our communication, if we can all speak all the languages, we wouldn't all speak the same language at the same time. We would actually choose the language that we would use to say the thing based on something we're trying to express, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think people understand that it's like, well, Italian, that would be the language we would pull for if we want to say something romantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we want to say something that way. If we're angry, I could see us very much pulling from the Russian, or even German, right? Something like that.
Those poor Germans.
Yeah, if we're wanting to frighten people, we would say, something we might say in another language, but we would choose that language because that language has that kind of a sound to it, or frankly, I've thought about this before, and to me, the language of French is clearly the language of like hedonic pleasure, right? Just very like base level, like instinctual pleasure, mainly of the kind of instincts that a Christian is trying to keep under wraps. But that would have a little self-control over. But that clearly, the French would be the language you would use to express those kind of sentiments. And so that if you can think about that, and if you catch what I'm saying, that's the idea of language being tailored to expressing certain things. And I think that if we look over time, then we see the difference in language better built around expressing the spiritual and the functional versus modern language, particularly English, built around expressing this like material truth.
Yeah, or even carving the way people think. Because if you look at German structurally is very logically constructed, whereas having learned a little bit of French, when you look at French, there's a lot of, you very quickly see that aesthetics are almost more important than logical consistency within French. So the grammar is a little bit confusing, and there's certain word orders that are a little bit confusing because it's more aesthetic than it is functional. And then taken to the extreme,
which by the way could be related to less moral consistency.
Right. Less structure. But then taken to its extreme, I was recently listening to an interview with I think her name is Yeonmi Park. I don't know if I'm going to get this off. It was a recent Jordan Peterson interview. He was interviewing someone who escaped from North Korea, and she talks about how within North Korea they've eliminated the word I or me, and so that word's not used at all. So if you're wanting to express something, you don't say I like food, you say we like food. And you say, we love the glorious leader, things like that. Exactly. But language then can influence people, so they lose that individual identity to some degree, and only can perceive things via that. Yeah, exactly. But that could be an example of taken to extreme. But I think this idea that language can certainly guide meanings and can have and can guide the lens through which you look at things,
Right.
is significant, you know,
Yeah.
which at the very beginning we talked about how, again, we're on the scale of the message is still important,
Yes.
and the fundamental message can get through, but there is, I think the resolution is a good idea because it's a level of depth, you know,
Yeah.
and oftentimes when you're dealing with something that's not, you can't find one unifying principle for it. You find yourself on a scale, and you
Yeah.
can go to one extreme or you can go to the other. You know, at one extreme you might
Exactly.
have the message translation. At the other, you might have somebody who gets a doctorate in Hebrew cultural studies in order to understand the Old Testament. You know,
Mhm.
like that's the scale that we're on, and you can find yourself somewhere in there.
Yes. Yes. All right. So with that in mind, that's what we'll be doing here, as we will very soon, episode 12. It's finally going to happen. We're finally going to start getting into the actual Bible verses themselves. At least we'll get 3 words into it on that episode. So look forward to that. Make sure you subscribe and follow and rate and review and like and all those kind of things wherever, so that you see that episode when we finally get there. And yeah, we'll look forward to hopefully helping bring the picture into focus.